Hi everyone, and welcome to this short break from my recent streak of 3-prizer shenanigans. Long story short, after slogging through a ton of games with those big and beefy VMAXs, I kind of felt like I needed a creative palette cleanser, and I kind of thought that dusting off an old classic might be the best way to go. So what I have for you this week is a modern take on a Vespiquen and Flareon deck. Now, this archetype was huge way back in the X and Y era, and as far as I'm told, still did pretty well up at least until the early era of tag teams. ADP, as always, seems to ruin the fun, at least after that. And, I figured that with a few tweaks, and as long as we could dodge ADP, we could probably give this a pretty good fighting chance against the 3-prizers that are running amok and expanded nowadays. So jumping right in, we of course have our deck boss, Vespiquen. It's a stage 1 with just 90 HP, but it does have free retreat, and most importantly, it has this one attack that we really care about. For 2 colorless energies, be revenged does 20 damage base, plus 10 more for every Pokemon in your discard pile. So obviously, the idea is to fill your discard pile with Pokemon and hit for big damage. Even against tag teams, you could potentially get to the 2-hit KO threshold pretty easily, but I do have to say that against VMAXs with their 300 plus HP, it's a little harder to reach those big numbers. But hopefully some of the interesting techs and our other attacker in this deck can maybe help us pick up the slack. Speaking of that other attacker, Team Plasma's Flareon is basically Vespiquen as a fire type. Its revenge attack does the exact same thing as Be Revenge, and for the exact same cost, making it a perfect partner to our deck boss, especially in those cases where you're going up against modern metal types who happen to resist grass. But Flareon also opens up some interesting tech options thanks to its base form being Eevee. The first of our spicy techs is this Jolteon from Ancient Origins. We can evolve it up from Eevee and take advantage of its electric effect ability, which turns all of our stage 1s into electric types alongside their existing types. So basically, this gives us the ability to hit for an additional weakness depending on the matchup. And if you're not playing against an electric weak deck, well, then it's easy discard fodder to power up our attackers. Vaporeon basically does the same thing as Jolteon, except that it adds the water type to your stage 1s, which is very useful against the fire type matchup. And again, if you don't need it, you can always pitch it for a little extra damage. Unown is a great consistency booster. If it happens to be on your bench, then you can discard it to draw 1 card. So what it does is help you cycle through your deck while powering up your attackers. And this really makes it an instant 4 of in pretty much any variation of this deck that you're ever going to put together. We also play the holy trinity of Dedenne-GX, Crobat V, and Tapu Lele-GX. The double Dedenne helps you dump Pokemon while burning through your deck, while Crobat V offers an additional extender, especially in those moments when you don't want to discard something in your hand like a special energy. And Tapu Lele, of course, lets you tutor a supporter from your deck, which can be critical given how low of a count we play, at least of physical supporters. And then we have a few one-offs just to help smooth over some of our bad matchups or improve the overall flow of the deck. Oranguru lets us stack the deck, usually saving a key card from being discarded or putting a draw supporter back into the deck just in case. Exeggcute allows for infinite discard fodder thanks to its propagation ability. Marshadow lets us pop stadiums while sending itself to the discard pile, which can help foil our enemy's plans at least a little bit, or get us out of an awkward spot with the 1 stadium that we actually play in this deck. And Mew is there to protect our very soft bench sitters from a bit of snipe and spread damage. On the supporter side, we only run 3 physical draw supporters, with that being a pair of Professor's Research and 1 N. Now, believe me, I really wish we had space for more, but this is really all we can squeeze because of the high Pokemon count we have. But thankfully, we do have plenty of outs to these supporters, especially the Pokemon which let us draw cards or, in the case of Tapu Lele, just tutor them directly out from the deck. Guzma enables some gusting and pivoting, and it plays particularly well with the high number of free retreaters like Vespiquen and Jolteon that we actually have in this deck. Teammates fetches any 2 cards from our deck on the condition that one of our Pokemon was KO'd the previous turn, and given how tiny our attackers actually are, it's a pretty easy condition to meet and means, if nothing else, you've at least guaranteed yourself a follow-up attack. And Pokemon Ranger is there to give us a fighting chance against ADP or even things like Luke Metal. We also have the 4 VS Seeker to patch up that low physical supporter count and allow us to toolbox them a bit more effectively. Now, Battle Compressor is the beating heart of this deck. You can discard any 3 cards from your deck with this, so you can dump Pokemon to fuel your attackers, dump supporters to occur with VS Seeker, or you can just thin your deck and make it easier for you to hit your combo pieces down the road. You need 4 of this. End of discussion on that front. We play a 4-3 split of Ultra Ball and Quick Ball. This gives us 7 outs to our holy trinity of support Pokemon, as well as easy discards as we search for our attackers. And thanks to these, you can thin your deck pretty well and almost always have access to what you need. Rescue Stretcher lets us grab back a Pokemon in a pinch or return 3 to our deck. Usually this is just for grabbing back a Vespiquen or a Flareon to evolve a basic that's waiting on the bench, but you can also use it to grab back one of our Holy Trinity pieces if they got KO'd or discarded. Rescue Trolley likewise gives us some recursion, grabbing Vespiquen but not Flareon, unfortunately. But what it's actually here for is to abuse Unown. Basically what you can do is pop your 2 Unown, draw 2 cards, grab them back with Rescue Trolley, and then pop them again to draw another 2 cards, which is kinda busted. Special Charge lets us recur our special energy, which is a must given how low of a physical count we run, and U-Turn Board gives us a reusable pivot. Most of our Pokemon are already free retreaters or only have a 1-cost retreat as is, so this basically ensures that we always have the ability to shuffle our board around as needed. And finally, we play a 4-2 split of DCE and Twin Energy. These let you pay for your attacks in 1 attachment, and alongside Special Charge, you can basically ensure that you always have enough attacks to close out a game. Also, running this count ensures that, bad prizes or a nasty discard here or there won't totally sink your game plan. And that's the deck. It is a pretty out there list, and believe me, you can get some bricky hands at times thanks to the high Pokemon count. But once the deck gets running, it is extremely efficient and can slap your opponent around with some pretty absurd numbers. Now, your best matchups are definitely going to be against 2 prizers, since you'll be trading pretty efficiently with them and even creeping up to the OHKO in some cases, but you can also still give 3 prizers a good run for their money as long as you pace yourself appropriately and very carefully choose your targets. And now with all of that out of the way, let's jump on over to the expanded ladder and see if Vespiquen-Flareon can still hold up in 2021. Okay, so our first match on the expanded ladder here is going to be against quite a classic, I would say, a veteran or a staple. Either way, it's against a deck that I think is still really scary to run into, whether you're playing on the ladder or in a tournament, even if it's not as common as it used to be, given how kind of beat sticky or control-y things are in expanded these days. Certainly with the takeover of tag teams, and VMAXs, a deck like this doesn't see as much play, but as you will see, it's still a very fierce contender. Now, looking at the start, both me and my opponent don't have the greatest starts to the game. They have the Tapu Lele-GX in the active, which is never great. You want to play that down later and tutor out your supporter. But I get stuck with an Eevee, which isn't doing much, and a hand that means, I'm going to be dumping at least something I'm not particularly keen on. Dumping a Vespiquen especially, which is a precious resource in and of itself, is never great. And things get more complicated once my opponent Day changes for a Zorua and a Trubbish. So basically at this point, I know I need to turbo through my deck and get rid of anything that has an ability, because anything with an ability is going to become a liability once Garbotoxin comes up. So, obviously I'm getting rid of a few things I know I'm not going to need right now, like the Jolteon and the Vaporeon, for example. If I can dump those, that's great, because they're not providing me any particular type advantage. Things like Oranguru as well, as much as I'd like to keep it, it's just not going to be particularly helpful, and, at worst, it could end up being a dead draw, which could cause me to fall behind in KOs. The unknowns as well, they're not much good to me under Garbotoxin, so I am just trying to turbo through them as much as possible. And of course take advantage of propagation while I still can here to just get some extra discards and get rolling. And ultimately, you know, the best I can do is kind of establish a board and get myself ready for when my opponent comes in swinging. The good thing is that, you know, I have my 2 Eevees, I have my 2 Combees, so I can evolve up into the only attacker I have available, which is a Vespiquen, and kind of start rolling from there. Now, my opponent also drops the Skyfield and then the Crobat V, which means that, yeah, a big attack is incoming, and they just start loading their bench up, and down comes the Garbodor. So, you know, thankfully my opponent did smack me with the N because I was looking at a pretty dead hand if they hadn't done that, so they kind of rescued me there. And then the Zoroark GX comes down, which means, alright, it's time to start trading, which my opponent does, pitching a VS Seeker, which will actually become relevant later on. But hey, you know, at this point they've already got the KO on board, and outside of maybe gusting up my Dedenne and taking an easy prize, you know, they're already sitting pretty anyways. And in fact, they actually tossed the Lysander there, I guess thinking it was more important to just take out my Eevee for whatever reason, or they just wanted to have the Lysander in the discard pile later to VS Seeker out. And then, of course, the Klefki pops its Wonderlock, attaching it to the Garbodor and turning on Garbotoxin for my turn, but not for my opponent. So I get another Eevee. Things aren't looking particularly great, but because I did dump the teammates early on, I can VS Seeker it out and then grab my first attacker. So what I decide to do is grab a Flareon and a Vespiquen just to make sure that I have 2 attackers ready to go. And, you know, I'm not going to be doing a ton of damage early on, but it should be enough to basically threaten the 2-hit KO. But what I'm also doing here is debating where to attach the U-turn board because I don't want it in hand. It's not really something I want to draw later on. I just want to make sure I always have access to it, basically. And then I just go for the swing, dealing a nice 100 damage, and, you know, once my opponent KOs the Vespiquen here, I have a guaranteed KO on the Zoroark. Now, I also bench that unknown. Obviously, it's not too useful at the moment, but I do know at least if the Skyfield gets popped for whatever reason, or if my opponent does not turn on Garbotoxin, I at least have the ability to draw that extra card and maybe get myself out of a bad situation. My opponent also starts using the Battle Compressor, get their own Propagation Execute out of the way, which again is an extra Pokemon that they have access to and can let them abuse trades additionally with that Zoroark GX that they've set up on the bench. They also established the Trashel Edge Garbodor, which means that, you know, they've basically got 3 attackers that I gotta muscle my way through, and they're already 2 prizes ahead, so, you know, things are a little tricky. Getting my own Battle Compressor, I basically take a look and I say, alright, as much as I don't want to dump a Dedenne or a Crobat, I have no choice. I just gotta get them out of there and give myself a better chance of drawing into relevant cards. And I do, thankfully, I get access to an Ultra Ball and a Twin Energy. I also critically get Parallel City, which I decide to play down now. Now, unfortunately, because I left Dedenne in the active, I wasn't able to get rid of it, which in hindsight was a bit of a misplay. I should have just brought up one of the Combee before, but I also thought that, you know, if my opponent took out the Dedenne, I might be able to do something cute with N, especially if my opponent was under Garbotoxin, which they would be for a while because they attached Muscle Band to the Garbodor. But regardless, taking advantage of the Skyfield, getting rid of a bunch of bench Pokemon, Parallel City actually allows me to get a pretty clean KO on the Zoroark, thanks to all the Pokemon that I discarded. Now, my opponent doesn't do anything too fancy on this coming turn. They basically just go for the Revenge KO, which is fine. I'm able to evolve up my Vespiquen, and I just continue to Battle Compressor stuff out because I know there's just a ton of cards I do not want to draw into. The Rescue Carrier, for example, it's not very useful if I can't be popping my unknowns and getting cheeky with that, so hey, let's just get rid of it and get to work. Now, I've got a couple options here. Basically, I need to make sure I get the return KO, and hey, you know, returning 2 Twin Energies deck is a pretty good place to start. I also have access to the VS Seeker, which means that with my teammates, I can guarantee that follow-up attack again. And in this case, of course, I want to grab another Vespiquen, and I need the energy to actually get rolling. Right? So at the very least, I know I have enough attackers if I need to close out the game. And thankfully, I've reached the threshold where I can now one-hit KO a Zoroark. And in fact, I managed to take out my opponent's last Zoroark which means that they've got one attacker remaining. Now, my opponent does bring up the Trash Launch here, and what they're going to do arguably is a misplay on their part. I'm pretty, I'm in a pretty bad situation as is. Like, an N would be pretty devastating for myself as well, but I think my opponent is basically just hoping that I'm going to whiff on the attachment, whatever the case may be, but they go for the counter catcher to drag up the Dedenne, and from there, I guess they're just hoping I'm not in a position to recover. And, they take out the Dedenne, which, yeah, nets them a nice 2 prizes, puts them down to 1. But, I mean, at this point, I've got the revenge attack going, and thanks to another Vespiquen, I'm able to grab the Guzma and then just gust up one of those juicy bench sitters, in fact, that Tapu Lele, for a pretty clean KO. Alright, now going into our second match, we came up against the dominant dark type deck. Well, maybe not so much an expanded, but a terror of many ladder player nonetheless. And we are off to a great start. You have to love PTCGO and the way it just bunches stuff up. 2 Dedenne, 3 Vespiquen, and an Eevee. Stuff I really don't want to be ditching off of a day-to-day change because that's basically gonna spell the end for me. So, I mean, up against the Malamar EX, the best I can do here is just bench the Eevee and hope I draw into a shuffle draw option in the next turn, because this is just brutal, man. My opponent, meanwhile, gets to set up as much as they want, getting down the Dark Rye in addition to an Eternatus V, which makes me think, oh man, I'm in a lot of trouble. They also dropped the Zigzagoon because why not? You gotta fill your bench up. But really here, they can just go for the Maximar and probably take out my Mew no problem, which they do. So yeah, I'm in a pretty rough spot as is. But thankfully I top deck the Vespiquen, which means that I can get an N or something to that effect out of my deck. And I'm debating for a little bit, getting propagation out of the way is the way to go. And I think Oranguru is not the best play either. But hey, there it is. I get to end my opponent up to 5, which isn't ideal either. But at the very least, I can get a fighting chance here. And lucky me, I do manage to get a Combee and a Flareon with the twin energy, which means, yeah, actually I can get some decent damage off this turn. I also get another battle compressor, so I'll dump the Jolteon and Vaporeon because I ain't hitting anything this here, at least nothing lightning or water weak. And then I'll just grab the Exeggcute as well, because hey, it means that I can Ultra Ball into a Dedenne or a Crobat if I want to get, a bit of a hand going for the next round. Which I do. It would have been nice to discard a few more Pokemon off of the Dedenne change, but hey, what can you do? You can also quick ball away the Pokémon Ranger, which is useless here, and grab the Marshadow because that's an easy pop in order to get rid of the Chaotic Swell. And at this point, I'm pretty well set up, so I can just go for the Vengeance, hit for 100 damage, which is, a guaranteed 2-hit KO on that Malamar next turn. My opponent, of course, has a nice little trick going because they're basically able to shuffle their board around at will thanks to that Darkrai EX granting free retreat to anything with a dark energy. So they're pretty quickly able to get the Eternatus powered up. They also go for a nice fat Colress, which makes me feel really bad. And they're basically setting themselves up pretty well. So what they can do and what they started to do later in the game is basically shuffle their attackers back and forth, knowing that, hey, if I don't have the gusting option, I basically can't chase down a Pokemon and then get the one-hit KO. Especially the Eternatus VMAX, because there's no way I'm one-shotting that, so they can basically just shuffle those around. And again, as long as I don't find the gusting option, there's not much I can do. Now, I do have some options. The Malamar is heavily damaged, there's a Galarian Moltres V on the bench, and there's a Crobat V as well. So those are all pretty easy targets that, I'll be able to one-shot fairly soon. So I'm not too worried there, and, at least my board state's not terrible. For example, I do have access to a Vespiquen now, thankfully evolving one up, and with propagation, I can go and grab myself another piece. Most likely right now I'm going to grab the follow-up Vespiquen because I just need to make sure I have the attackers on board, because, whiffing those will be the enemy, right? I cannot miss a beat in this game because it'll basically allow my opponent to just get too much of a lead and I won't be able to KO the big guys consistently enough. And now I am in a really good spot because I've got 2 Flareon, 2 Vespiquen, and my discard pile is starting to swell with Pokemon. I can also start chaining together the Unown right now to just get that little extra damage buff, you know, keep things going here, and, you know, get myself an additional Combee, which means, again, I got a follow-up attacker guaranteed. Now, I choose not to attach Twin Energy because Crushing Hammer and Enhanced Hammer are a thing in Expanded, and there's just no point in doing it. My opponent gets the VMAX going, which means I'm going to have to deal, I believe it's, 220 additional damage to get that guy knocked out. Which is a bit of a stretch for my guys here, but I mean, hey, if any deck can do it, I guess Vespiquen-Flareon can. So, you know, I promote my attacker, I decide to ditch a Combee and an Eevee, and then, you know, I managed to get a follow-up Vespiquen anyways. Basically, I've got 4 attackers to close out the game, and that's 4 attackers, you know, for the 4 prizes my opponent could take. I also, unfortunately, have a couple of Dedenne sitting on there, which is not great because they can be gusted up for an easy KO. But, you know, you gotta do what you gotta do, especially with the rough start I had. Now, my opponent does start shuffling their board around a little bit. They retreat the heavily damaged Eternatus to prevent the KO, and they bring up a fresh one, which I definitely can't one-shot. But thankfully, I do get a hold of my Parallel City, so I'm able to pop the Dedennes and take away the easy 2 prizes for my opponent. Things are still not great, but hey, I at least managed to get myself a Guzma, and thanks to a pretty potent discard pile, my Vespiquen is actually able to take out the damaged Eternatus. Now, there's still the question of how I'm going to go through 3 more prizes worth of Pokemon, but in theory, as long as I can keep chaining my attackers together and chase down the damaged Eternatus, I should have just enough to see me through the game. And at this point, I do have a guaranteed 2-hit KO on the Eternatus, which is fantastic. I do get the additional Eevee, which is great as well, and now I'm really just, you know, using Battle Compressor to take out literally anything that could be a liability in my deck, right? Like even with an N or a Marnie, I can basically draw into anything that I need in order to take my opponent down. So I go for a big 240 on the Eternatus, nowhere close to a 1-hit KO, but it's enough that he's certainly feeling threatened, and, you know, he goes for the VS Seeker, decides to grab the Colress, I guess, just to see the most number of options here. He can't, you know, chain together Zigzagoon Pings or anything like that to kill me, and, you know, moving the energy to Darkrai EX, for example, if he had a Weavile, wouldn't have done much either. But hey, he plays to his outs, he brings up the fresh Eternatus, and he takes out my guys, but thankfully I have the VS Seeker for the Guzma, which means I am taking a pretty clean KO, again, on the damaged Eternatus. And my opponent, of course, was lame and decided to scoop. Okay, so I'm pretty confident in saying those were some games. I don't know about you guys, but it always kind of warms my heart whenever you run into an old classic on the ladder. Beats running into Donk and other stuff like that. And Zoroark Garbodor is definitely where it's at. And that Eternatus game, usually, you know, I don't like running into Eternatus because Eternatus. I also just generally don't like playing against it, especially with, you know, more rogue lists like this, because I know it's going to be an uphill battle. But holy cow, that was quite the game, especially after what I think we can say was a pretty rough start on my side. And I mean, look, Vespiquen still has it. And I think both games are a pretty good illustration of how managing your resources and carefully choosing your targets can make all the difference in the world when you're working with a rogue deck like this one. Now, don't get me wrong, those were both incredibly stressful games, and my opponents very nearly had me both times. But I do think the fact that I could still have these very close matches shows that Vespiquen can still put in work with a decent list and semi-competent handling. Now, I will also say that damage ramping is a bit of an issue. In particular, it took too long to be able to threaten Eternatus VMAX with a 2-hit KO, and honestly, in hindsight, going after the 2 prizes on my opponent's bench might have been the more efficient way to go about things, especially since some of them were grass weak. But yeah, 340 HP is just a bit too much to ask of Vespiquen, especially considering the fact that you can't even come close to hitting numbers like that outside of weakness, obviously. But you know, at the end of the day, we did it. I can breathe a sigh of relief. And I've certainly got my hopes high that the next classic deck we decide to pick up will maybe yield some similarly positive results. But, you know, time will tell. If you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure to show your appreciation with a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and, subscribe if you haven't already. And if there's a classic deck that you'd like me to look into, please do let me know. I'm having a real hoot in, putting together these old pieces, collecting the odd cards here and there, and taking them for a spin. So the more suggestions, the merrier. And anyways, you guys enjoy what's left of the day. I will catch you next time. And until then, take it easy.